everyone, welcome to the new video. So today we will understand about how application is designed, like actually for Kubernetes. If we are going to deploy an application, so what all actually manifest.yamls are required, what we actually deploy as what. So we'll try to understand it through an application perspective. So let's go. So suppose we have an application, it can be any Java based application or Python based application, and I want to do the deployment on Kubernetes cluster. So for any application, when we do a deployment, so what all minimum things or what all things that are required for in Kubernetes, that we'll understand today. So we require, first of all, the Docker image of your application. So image, to make it run on any environment, we need to create a Docker image of our application. So what all steps we are performing for building an application manually, those steps will include in Docker file, and we'll create a Docker image. Okay. So Docker image will be required to run our application on Kubernetes cluster. So after Docker image, we will require pod. So pod is actually a container inside which our app will run. So pod is like what you say, a container inside which our application, our image will be deployed, or image will be made to run. Then comes deployment. Deployment are like replicas of the pod. So deployment helps in rolling update, rollout. If suppose any pod or the pods inside which are contained in inside which our application is running, if one of the pod is not working, so the next pod can handle that. For that, we need a deployment, because deployment will have a replicas of of our application. It will create the pods which will have the replicas of our application. So to handle the scaling down, or updates, that's why we deploy our application using deployment service. Then we need service. Why service is needed? If we want our app, if we want that our application, when it is deployed on a pod, so our pods, when we are creating the replicas of the pod, because we are using deployment, so those pods should communicate with each other. So to establish the communication, we need some kind of service. After that, the pod can also communicate to the outside world. Okay, external communication. To how to establish it, we need a service for it. So that's why service is needed. Okay, then we have config maps and secrets. So what are this? When we are having our application, we will have some environment variables that that has to be accessible to the outside world, that has to be accessible to our pod also, our application also, because those credentials are being used by our application. Whether it can be a database credential, because our application would be communicating, maybe our application would be communicating to our database. So to connect to the database, our pod should have the credentials stored, and we cannot store the credentials like that. Okay, for that we need configs map and secrets. There is a difference between configs map and secrets. Both are used to store, some kind of sensitive data, but secrets we can store data in a base in 64 encoded, but in configs map we cannot do it. So that's why config map and secrets are generally required for any application that we are going to deploy. Okay, then comes probes. Probes are like liveliness, readiness probe. It is basically we create probes to check that whether our app is healthy or not. So that's why we create probes inside our application when we are going to deploy an application. Then after props, we need the auto scaling. So for that, we have horizontal pod auto scaler. So maybe when there is some issue, so these auto scalers help in scaling of pods. Okay, horizontally means the number of the pods will be increased, and if some issue is there with the pod, so horizontal pod autoscaler will help in increasing the basically if there is more memory utilization. So basically it's not a issue with the pod, but when we set the target that if cpu or memory utilization of all the pods, so the average will be taken of the cpu and memory utilization of all the pods, and if that average is going above the threshold, then the horizontal pods autoscaler come in picture, and it will help in scaling up our pods number. So you don't get confused with the benefit of deployment in horizontal pod autoscaler. So horizontal pod autoscaler is configured to scale up the pods number of pods when the utilization is going above the threshold, but deployment helps in maintaining the minimum and max replicas of the pod. So whenever any issue is going into any error state or any crash loop back state, so it will try to come into the set minimum and max replica state. So after that, after horizontal, so this for an application to deploy, we will need horizontal pod autoscaler. Then we will need stateful set. Stateful set is basically when we want to deploy a database. So about stateful set, why it is said stateful set? Because we need to maintain the data. The data should not be lost. So that's why state has to be maintained. So that's why it is called stateful set, because the data cannot go if one pod dies, because every time pod, if we deploy it as a if we deploy a database as a form of deployment, so pods are dynamic, which are created dynamically. So if one pod dies, if the next pod is created, it will not retain the data. But in database we cannot do that, because we need that data. So that's why we need to deploy our databases using stateful set. So for these are the minimum services of Kubernetes that we will need to deploy an application on Kubernetes cluster. Uh, on Kubernetes cluster. So that's all for today's video. I am giving a gist. In next video, I'll try to, you know, write the manifest.yaml for everything that I have explained today, so that we can further try to deploy that application and run it. So it will be more clear. The Kubernetes concept will be more clear to every one of you. So yeah, that's all. That's all for today's video. I hope it's helpful. Please let me know your views in the comment section. Till then, take care. Bye.